Thank you all for joining. Ambassador Choi, President Lee, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very delighted that the Sejong Institute and the East Asian Institute Korea Center are joining in organizing this important seminar, which I hope will be an inaugural seminar, and it will have many more seminars to come in future. The Sejong Institute is, of course, a very renowned institute in Korea, and we are very delighted to partner up with you. This webinar comes at the most interesting times. Of course, there is the world is captured by the U.S.-China tension, but there is other countries, and we are delighted to learn that the Republic of Korea, the Yoon Suk Yeol administration has recently introduced its own Indo-Pacific strategy, and more importantly for today, the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, or KASI. And this is for us a milestone, and I think this webinar will go deep into what this actually means for us here in ASEAN and for the Korea-ASEAN relationship. And for us, it is important to understand the Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, on how Korea looks at the very, very big picture. But it's also important for us to understand whether KASI is something very new, and if we can look forward to, if you want, a further upgrade of ASEAN-Korea relationships, or whether it's something more of the same in the spirit of the new Southern policy of the previous administration. And of course, for us in ASEAN, the key is that we can develop relationships amongst Asian countries that actually do not focus all on this US-China tension. As a matter of fact, there is numerous reasons to have good relationship among ASEAN countries and Korea, and those are independent of the great power competition that we see and that we have, but that could to some extent be seen as the background of this relationship between Korea and ASEAN countries. I would like to especially thank His Excellency the Republic of Korea Ambassador to Singapore, Mr. Choi Hyun, for him to deliver the keynote speech. And I would like to thank all the speakers for joining us today and the audience for listening in. With that, I would like to hand over to President Lee of the Sejong Institute. I will not introduce you. There's a very long CV on the program. So Professor Lee Sang-Yoon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
East Asia Institute in National University of Singapore. As Professor Lam Peng mentioned that I and he met about 2 decades ago in one of the conferences held in Hong Kong. And I still remember some of the conversation we had, and also we had a good time visiting Macau and many other places. Last year, Professor Lam visited my institute, and so that's how we agreed to have this webinar today. So I appreciate all that process, and it is indeed my pleasure to have a good partnership with the East Asia Institute. So, as Professor Hofman, as you mentioned, South Korea's Yoon Suk Yeol administration continues to engage in Indo-Pacific or ASEAN region. In the previous administration, South Korea had a policy called the New Asian Initiative, New Southern Policy. Although this government does not use that term anymore, but that policy still continues in the legacy, as a legacy in this government's Indo-Pacific strategy. So last December, government announced its own Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that, and still governments are working on to figure out some of the detailed action plan and roadmap for in the near future. So today, I would like to welcome all of the panelists, the distinguished panelists, and also I expect very constructive and delightful conversation today. And of course, I think this is a just a good start. And I expect that Sejong and East Asia Institute will continue partnership in this area. So thank you very much, and I would like to welcome all of you.
Thank you, President Lee. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Choi of the Republic of Korea to Singapore. Ambassador Choi was, before he joined, he was here in Singapore. He was the Deputy Chairman of the Deputy Chairman for International Cooperation at the Financial Services Committee. Before that, he has a very long and distinguished career in the Ministry of Finance and Economy. And amongst the many things that he did, he was also the Director General for the Greater Tumen Initiative, which is one of the more intriguing and maybe perhaps dormant, but potentially future very important initiatives that brings together a number of the two countries on the Korean Peninsula, but also China and Russia and others. There is an extensive CV on the web, so I won't waste too much of people's time and hand over to Ambassador Choi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction to me. A very good morning, everyone. Professor Bert Hofman, Director of the East Asian Institute, Dr. Lee Hyun, President of Sejong Institute, Ambassador Lim Sungnam, distinguished participants, colleagues, and friends. Let me begin by expressing my congratulations on the inaugural seminar jointly hosted by Korea Center and Sejong Institute. Korea Center, opened in November 2021, is the first academic center in Southeast Asia dedicated to the study of the Korean Peninsula and beyond. It has so far contributed to the deepening of understanding of the Korean Peninsula issues and the Korea-ASEAN relationship. It gives me a pleasure to see that Korea Center has established a partnership with Sejong Institute, one of the most prestigious think tanks in Korea, by hosting today's webinar. Furthermore, I'm grateful for the opportunity to explain today's topic, Korea's Indo-Pacific concept and the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, and hear valuable perspective and insight on those initiatives. Before I dive into Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, it is important to highlight the significance of the Indo-Pacific region for Korea. As is well known as an open economy heavily reliant on exports, Korea earned 85% of its GDP from foreign trade in 2021. In particular, the Indo-Pacific represent approximately 67% and 78% of total imports and exports, respectively. Moreover, a significant portion of trade goes through sea routes in the Indo-Pacific. Additionally, 66% of foreign direct investment is destined for the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, rules-based international order, peace, and prosperity in this region hold critical importance for Korea. However, we are currently facing multiple intertwined challenges in this region, catalyzed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rising geopolitical competition, supply chain disruption, and a worsening security environment, to name just a few. The impact of the Ukraine crisis have raised the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Straits, and in the South China Sea, and jeopardized the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. Against the backdrop of this polycrisis, President Yoon Suk Yeol announced the strategy for a free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region on 11th November 2022 at the 23rd ASEAN Outlook Summit. Based on the principles of cooperation of inclusive, trust, and reciprocity, its geographical scope widely includes North Pacific, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania, Africa coast of the Indian Ocean, where the Europe and Latin America consider the major partners. The strategy contains comprehensive policy orientation and guidance and underscores Korea's strong commitment to increase its role and contribution in this region. Based on our enhanced stature in the international community and our strengths, such as cutting-edge technology, soft power, and education, Korea will increase its contribution to addressing the challenges in the Pacific. As my Singaporean friends lightly pointed out, it's timely in a way to guide AUKUS engagement with other parts of the world, considering its capabilities and contribution in other global issues beyond the Korean Peninsula. According to the State of the Southeast Asia Survey, the annual report released last February by ICS, Korea still needs to do more in this region, despite an overall increase in respondents who feel that Korea has the most political and strategic influence and economic power in Southeast Asia this year. The Indo-Pacific strategy emphasized ASEAN as Korea's key partner. Korea launched Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, or KASI in short, as a regional policy specifically designed for ASEAN within the overarching framework of its strategy. ASEAN has a population of 661 million people, with 60% below the age of 35, and a combined GDP of $3 trillion that is expected to double within the next 2 decades. Since the establishing dialogue relations in 1989, the ASEAN AUKUS partnership has made great stride in economic, social, and cultural development. KASI builds on the existing solid partnership to foster a more comprehensive partnership encompassing cooperation in security as well as future and emerging issues. KASI has 8 core lines of effort delineated as priority areas of cooperation. These include the first, upgrading the ASEAN AUKUS partnership and strengthening bilateral relations with the ASEAN member states. Second, enhancing ASEAN AUKUS cooperation within ASEAN-led mechanisms. Third, expanding ASEAN AUKUS comprehensive security cooperation. The fourth, promoting ASEAN AUKUS strategic cooperation. The fifth, expanding cooperation in future and emerging areas. The sixth, jointly addressing and responding to regional and global challenges. The seventh, promoting future generation exchanges as drivers of future prosperity. And the last, the eighth, increasing ASEAN AUKUS cooperation resources. KASI does not indicate that Korea is leaning toward a specific country in the middle of the geopolitical rivalry in the region. Korea's strategy of the Indo-Pacific emphasized the importance of inclusiveness in working with partners. Thus, we are open to working with any country in tune with our vision and principles of cooperation. KASI's first priority is to firmly support ASEAN centrality and ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, that is AOIP, as well as bolster contribution to cooperation in ASEAN-led mechanism. KASI builds upon the existing progress of the new Southern policy and aims to redefine a perspective for the equal and balanced relationship between Korea and ASEAN, rather than simply advancing toward ASEAN from Korea's standpoint. KASI is more substantive and comprehensive in encompassing ASEAN's 3 pillars of political security, economic, and social-cultural community. KASI allows the scheme to evolve with new demands and suggestions of ASEAN member states. Today's webinar will shed more light on how to bring Korea-ASEAN cooperation to new heights for the benefit of both countries and the region as a whole. Once again, I would like to express my gratitude to Korea Center and Sejong Institute for organizing this webinar. My appreciation also goes to all scholars and experts who have joined from Seoul and Singapore to impart your wisdom. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Choi. Those are very good words for us to start the webinar with. we have lots to debate, and not least the views on Indo-Pacific. But as I said, I think we are focusing on the cooperation Korea and ASEAN that has great prospects. And as a matter of fact, up until now, as far as I look at the numbers, the great power competition has been beneficial for ASEAN as well as Korea because of the diversification that is taking place. That's not a good thing in the long run, but it is actually not such a bad thing in the short run, as far as I can see. With those words, I would like to hand over to President Lee, who will be managing the first session of the webinar. Thank you all very much. President Lee, over to you.
Well, thank you. First session will discuss Seoul's Indo-Pacific concept, a comparison. So as I mentioned, South Korean government has had a policy of the New Southern policy in previous administration. Now it is carried over to Indo-Pacific strategy. So in this session, we would like to look into what's in there, South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy, and what kind of a challenge and opportunity will this policy have in the coming years. So we have three excellent panelists in this, four panelists in this session. And Dr. Yoon Jung, fellow at Sejong Institute, and she's the director of the Indo-Pacific Research Center here. And Dr. Ryan Clark, East Asia Institute, National University of Singapore. And Dr. Nur Shahada Jamil, University of Malaysia. And also we have one commentator, Professor Sejong, who worked for Kyung University, and now he's affiliated as a visiting scholar at Sejong Institute. So we do not have much time for this session, so I would like to urge each panelist speak strictly under 10 minutes and have some more discussion, Q&A for the remaining time. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Yoon Jung about Yoon administration's Indo-Pacific concept. So Dr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. And thank you for explaining the grounds of Indo-Pacific discussion so well, Ambassador Choi Hyun. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce how Korea views the Indo-Pacific region and how this Korean perspectives is reflected in Korea's approach to the Indo-Pacific. There are several main reasons why Korea announced its Indo-Pacific strategy. I will first briefly introduce the underlying hidden background that is not explicitly stated in the strategy document. Both of these responses are closely related to Korea's responses to great power competition and their power projection. First, as an ally of the United States, the announced strategy is designed to align South Korea with the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. As you may have seen, the strategy document includes many concepts that are similar to the US's Indo-Pacific strategy. Second, Korea had to adjust its relations with China. The announcement shows that Korea would not allow unilateral and coercive, in parentheses, Chinese action by articulating that Sino-Korean relations should be based on mutual respect and reciprocity, as well as guided by international norms and rules. However, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy has other aspects beyond its responses to the power struggle between the US and China and Korea's bilateral relations with them. Another crucial aspect was a recognition that it is essential to address the various challenges prevalent in the Indo-Pacific region and to find new opportunities for various challenges for shared prosperity. As was well explained by Ambassador Choi, of course, as was explained by Ambassador Choi, the South Korea's national interests are directly related to the stability and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. And they include rising geopolitical competition, terrorism, climate change, a deepening arms race, North Korea's advancement of nuclear and missile capabilities, disruption of supply chains, and so forth. Korea hopes to address the previous issues through collective regional effort. Moreover, the Yoon administration clearly thinks of the Indo-Pacific as a crucial geopolitical space. In fact, the administration actively seeks out an agenda for cooperation and shapes discussions in the region and the wider world. With this background, Korea seeks to build an international order in the region with a vision for the Indo-Pacific that has three major aspects, which are freedom, peace, and prosperity. And its strategy is guided by three principles of cooperation. They are inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity, which leave room for cooperation with all countries. As it explicitly states, our inclusive Indo-Pacific strategy neither targets nor excludes any specific nation. We will work with every partner that is aligned with our vision and principles of cooperation. In this regard, Korea's strategy is broad in its geographical reach, encompassing North Pacific countries to coastal West African countries. The centerpiece of strategy, however, is obviously the Southeast Asian region, as evidenced by the initial unveiling of the strategy itself at the ASEAN Outlook Summit last year. And the IPS makes a nod to ASEAN in its explicit support for ASEAN centrality in AOIP, as was well explained by Ambassador Choi. And further, our strategy outlines specific 9 areas of cooperation, or core lines of efforts. As you can see, it should be seen in the space, but anyhow, we have in total 9 areas of cooperation, including to build regional order based on norms and rules, and strengthen non-proliferation and counter-terrorism efforts across the region, and to expand the comprehensive security cooperation, and to build economic security networks. So all these of 9 core areas of cooperation are crucially important for achieving the objectives of the Indo-Pacific strategy introduced earlier, and must be pursued as key areas of focus. Now, the Korea government is currently working on establishing more specific plans with relevant ministries and stakeholders for each region and area of cooperation. There are still many challenges to achieving Korea's diplomatic vision of becoming global pivotal state, particularly when it comes to managing relations with China. Nonetheless, Korea's strategy emphasizes contributing to the region through concrete and mutually beneficial cooperation with regional partners. In this context, the success of the strategy will depend, in large part, on how responsive it is to accommodating the growing cooperation needs of regional countries. So as we look forward to hearing the opinions of our ASEAN colleagues, let me stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We have a little bit technical problem with the slideshow, but anyhow, thank you, Dr. Choi, for giving some overview about Yoon administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. And next speaker is Dr. Ryan Clark. He'll talk about U.S. perspective, IPC and Quad AUKUS. So, floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. And good morning to Ambassador Choi and all our friends at Sejong. Thanks so much for making the time and for hosting this, co-hosting this event with us. So I'll keep my comments brief and to the point so we have more time for discussion. So basically, when I look at the U.S. Indo-Pacific concept at the moment, it's essentially a combination of 2 things. One, it's upholding the essentially 350-year-old open market, open seas, maritime-based international order, if you will, that was initially set up or established by the Dutch, then picked up by the British, and then has been kind of managed by the Americans since the end of World War II. And I think the second component is maintaining the post-World War II regional security architecture with the base structure and the alliance structure, and ensuring that that infrastructure or that architecture holds even as the People's Republic of China becomes increasingly assertive and ambitious in terms of its activities in its own immediate geography and then outside the first and second island chain. There's two regional groupings which I think are quite interesting to focus on. One I think is more relevant for the U.S. relationship with South Korea than the other, but I'll focus on the Quad first. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of media coverage, a lot of messaging coming out of the State Department and out of the White House around the Quad. I think there's a couple of course, there's been some positive elements associated with it. The Malabar military exercises that occur under that framework. There's been some definitive outputs that have come from it, but there's a major structural problem that, as far as I can tell, hasn't been adjudicated and hasn't even been addressed yet, and that is a lot of the variables or free variables associated with India. So under the Quad structure, you have the US, Australia, and Japan, who have been allies since the end of World War II anyways, in the case of the US and Australia before that. India is a bit of an outlier, if I can speak so frankly. And one of the challenges are, because India has such a complex strategic environment, both internally with domestic security issues and a lot of border disputes, including with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, and with China, which has gained a lot more attention and prominence. One of the challenges is that at what threshold or at what point do India's defense or security concerns rise or accelerate to the level of being a Quad level concern that would potentially necessitate a Quad level response? And this is not a trivial issue. This is actually a fairly substantial issue. And until that's resolved, the Quad is going to have some rust on its wheels, I have to say. It doesn't mean that it's an inert organization. It's just going to, in my opinion, at least my humble opinion, it's going to relentlessly underperform. AUKUS is a little bit of a different situation in that it's much more compact. It's 3 parties focused on essentially providing Australia with nuclear submarine capabilities. And of course, there's going to be a lot of other platforms that come in over time. And of course, when this was first announced, I lived in Australia when I was a kid, so I have some friends down there, and they were making jokes about Australia couldn't even build a canoe, ha ha ha. Well, it looks like this is going to proceed. It's just going to take quite some time before Australia has its own domestic capability. It's going to take some time, but in the interim, Australia has been able to obtain a whole fleet of Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines from the U.S. And I was looking at some of the technical specs of them this morning, and it's their sensor arrays, their ability to detect other subs at sea in terms of under a whole range of different conditions and at different lengths. It's quite incredible. And I think this is going to be the kind of the next phase. The nuclear submarines, especially Virginia class, that's going to be the next phase of this AUKUS. It's going to be the foundation, frankly speaking. And there's a joke in navies around the world that there are basically 2 types of ships: submarines and targets. And I think the fact that the submarine element is being focused, especially nuclear powered, because they're quiet, of course, they can move quickly. There's a whole range of tactical advantages associated with it. That's quite interesting. And I think this is where it becomes quite interesting, because you can see a potential structural opportunity for what I've called, in one of the previous background briefs that I published for the East Asian Institute, what we call AUKUS++. And I think I mentioned this on some of our calls or some of our discussions before. Given the fact that we have a tight alliance structure in AUKUS with the UK, Australia, and the US, and then, for example, a long-time US ally like South Korea, with a whole range of concerns, shared concerns over what's occurring in Beijing and how it could manifest itself in Southeast Asia, and East China Sea, etc. This is an area where I could, one domain area where I could see quite a lot of opportunity, executable opportunity for expansion in terms of interoperability, doctrinal development, and joint response capability. Because I think, as everyone has mentioned, of course, we want to make sure that the situation in our neighborhood remains the way it has been since the end of World War II, stable, peaceful, and a nice place to live. And I think the best way to do this is to ensure that what I guess you would call mutual deterrence, to take an old Cold War concept, if I may. And I think the submarine element is one of the most effective ways to do that, because it injects a degree of strategic uncertainty into any situation that's very hard for anyone to account for. And I think it's not a coincidence that the very first action taken by AUKUS, for example, is to build out nuclear-powered submarines, attack submarines, and then providing Virginia-class submarines in the interim period while the defense industrial base in Adelaide gets up to speed. I think this is going to be an area of cooperation between the US and South Korea as well, because of the alliance structure, shared concerns, relative symmetries in terms of defense industrial base and manufacturing capability. Of course, South Korea has the ability to produce these. I always make the joke, South Korea can produce submarines like this, like Kia's. It's absolutely no issue at all. And I think that's one very interesting synergy. And I think it's something that we're going to see more further developments further developments within. And I think this is going to have an effect. Of course, it's very exciting to see this new Southern policy coming out of Seoul. Of course, there's going to be shared concerns in Southeast Asia as well. And it'll be very interesting specifically, and I'll wrap up with this, how these developments interact with the concept of ASEAN centrality, and specifically the individual country of Indonesia, because of course, whichever way Indonesia decides to bend in this area, of course, will have an outsized effect on the rest of Southeast Asia. And I'll wrap up my remarks with that. Thank you very much.
Next speaker is Dr. Noor Shahada Jamil. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Well, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really happy to see so many familiar faces here again. But before I begin, please allow me to take just a few minutes to express my gratitude to the organizer for giving me this opportunity to participate in this webinar today. I was requested to speak specifically on ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or the AOIP. And some of the questions we tend to ask ourselves when we talk about ASEAN relationship or South Korea Indo-Pacific strategy and also the AOIP would include the question of, first, to what extent is Seoul Indo-Pacific strategy actually converge with the AOIP? Second, is the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, or KASI, is actually an upgrade from the previous NSP under Moon administration, or it is a downgrade, right? These are the questions that we will ask. And then lastly, how can the Republic of Korea or South Korea and ASEAN member states can cooperate for our common interests amid intensifying US-China rivalry? And what are the challenges ahead? So I will try to cover this question. I'll try my best to cover this question for the coming 10 minutes. So as we all know, President Yoon has announced the South Korea strategy for a free, peaceful, and also prosperous Indo-Pacific region, which is in short ROK's Indo-Pacific strategy, and also KASI at the ASEAN-Korea Summit in Cambodia, November last year. So the strategy actually converges with the AOIP in a few dimensions, and these dimensions includes the principles, mechanisms, and also areas of cooperation. So in terms of principle, South Korea Indo-Pacific strategy put forward 3 principles of cooperation: inclusiveness, trust, and also reciprocity, with the aim to promote and also strengthen strategic partnership in the region. By doing so, South Korea is actually conveying the message to the world that it does not really intend to target or exclude a particular power or a certain country amid ongoing competition between Washington and also Beijing. And the strategy actually aimed to establish a peaceful and also stable environment where every country in the region can benefit from. This principle of inclusiveness or inclusivity is also something that ASEAN values very much. And this is reflected through the AOIP as well, where the AOIP is actually a guideline, a friendly guideline geared towards functional cooperation that would promote openness and also inclusive in the region. And in addition, the AOIP also highlight other principles such as mutual trust and also the establishment or promotion of a rules-based framework or order, which is also something that can be observed in our Indo-Pacific strategy. And then in terms of mechanism, the AOIP seeks to utilize ASEAN-led mechanism as an approach to preserve what we call ASEAN centrality. And the document has identified East Asia Summit, or EAS, among others, as key platform for us to discuss regional issues and also challenges. And again, the ROK has expressed its unwavering support for both ASEAN centrality and also AOIP. Then in terms of area of cooperation, Seoul has proposed 9 priority areas, as you know, to implement under its Indo-Pacific strategy. So these areas include promotion of cooperation in the field of science and technology, bridging digital divide in the region, promotion of regional cooperation on climate change, promotion of tailored development cooperation partnerships, and also the facilitation of mutual understanding and also exchanges. So these are among the These are also among the priority areas listed in the AOIP. And under Indonesia's Indonesian ASEAN chairmanship this year, we can see how ASEAN AUKUS cooperation is generally focusing on the implementation of 4 priority areas, namely maritime cooperation, connectivity, UN Sustainable Development Goals, cooperation. This is another area or dimension where South Korea Indo-Pacific strategy and the AOIP actually converge. Then let's move to CASI. So CASI actually offers clarity on how the new strategy would shape the trajectory of Korea's relationship with Southeast Asia, and also on how Seoul will approach ASEAN in the coming years. And there are a few points that I would like to highlight here. First is that the initiative indicates that ASEAN policy right now has become a subset of Seoul's broader Indo-Pacific strategy, where the ROK, recognizing the fact that it can no longer afford to keep shying away from the current geopolitical realities in the region, now intend to expand its geographical scope of regional engagement beyond Southeast Asia through this Indo-Pacific strategy. This is something very different, and it is a very clear departure from Moon's NSP or NSP+, which focuses primarily on ASEAN. Secondly, the initiative also reflects President Yoon's intention to pursue a more robust and also stronger ASEAN policy in comparison to the NSP, because we can see that Seoul has proposed to elevate the existing ASEAN-Korea partnership into what we call the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership 2024, which marks the 35th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between ASEAN and also South Korea. In fact, the South Korean government also announced that it would double up cooperation fund related to ASEAN until 2027 as means to facilitate greater cooperation between the two in the future. But what's more important is that CASI also envisioned a comprehensive strategic partnership that include a new focus on addressing strategic and also security issues, in addition to the economic, social, and also cultural cooperation that the previous administration has been focusing on. For instance, CASI proposes for South Korea and ASEAN to hold regular strategic dialogues between our senior officials to discuss the issue of regional peace and security. It also proposed for us to regularize ASEAN ROK Defense Minister meeting that was held virtually last year as a one-off event, as well as for us to further bolster security and also defense cooperation between Korea and also Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN member states. So through all this development, we can actually expect President Yoon to drive his future ASEAN policy more towards this direction. But despite all this positive and also encouraging progress that we have made, ASEAN ROK relationship, just like any other relationship, is not always rainbows and butterflies, right? Meaning that it can also have various complexity and also challenges where we need to address. And one example would be with the release of South Korea Indo-Pacific strategy. South Korea at present will be expected to demonstrate its commitment to what it meant by the rules-based order, and to address some of the contentious issues in the region. For example, the dispute in East and South China Sea, as well as the Taiwan Strait issue, all involving an increasingly influential and powerful great power, China. Although the strategy report has openly called China a key partner for achieving prosperity and peace in the Indo-Pacific, and it also writes that South Korea support an Indo-Pacific where nations that represent diverse political systems can move forward together peacefully through competition and cooperation based on rules, as a gesture not to antagonize China. But this also indicates that future cooperation between Seoul and China in the Indo-Pacific would be entirely depending on how China is behaving in the future, or depending on China's action in the future. And this actually raised new expectation about the role that South Korea can play in the region. As for now, I think it is not clear whether Seoul will be able to stay firm and keep its word, especially in a situation we can foresee how China actually ramp up its assertiveness, for example, in the South China Sea. So how Seoul would react to this kind of behavior, especially when it tries to avoid backlash and also possible economic pressure from Beijing. So this, in my opinion, would be the largest or biggest challenge for Seoul Indo-Pacific strategy at the moment. And with that, I think I'll end my speech for today, and we can discuss more about this during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
All of the three presentation, and well, we will continue question and answer and discussion. And before that, I would like to invite Dr. Professor Sejong as a comment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Professor Jungkun Seo in the Department of Political Science at Kyung University, and as the President introduced on the outset, I'm now a visiting scholar at the Sejong Institute, and I'm very happy to be a part of this inaugural Korea Center Sejong Institute webinar, and I'm given about 10 minutes to give my 2 cents for each presenter, and if some time is left for me later on, I can share some of my thoughts about the domestic politics of U.S. foreign policy. So let me start with Dr. Choi. As we all know, the polarized politics is the buzzword in Seoul, in South Korea, just like a lot of many different countries, including the United States. So when it comes to polarization in domestic politics and foreign policy, we seem to have sort of Indo-Pacific strategies newly developed, newly termed every single 5-year period. Because in South Korea, we have a one-term presidency, and theoretically speaking, we can have a 5-year president changing very periodically. So the Yoon administration, as you have well laid out, has introduced a new Indo-Pacific strategy for the region. And what I'm curious about is sort of how much conservative elements in there and how much liberal elements in there in the new Indo-Pacific strategies introduced by the Yoon administration. The reason why I'm asking this question, maybe I know this sounds like a sort of tough question, but the reason why I'm asking this question is that not only for the people in South Korea, but for the world outside, the policy stability may be some of the concerns other countries might have when it comes to South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategies. Because we used to have a new Southern policy pushed by the Moon administration, the previous administration. And now we have the Yoon administration, new conservative regime, having laid out the new Indo-Pacific strategy. So in terms of policy stability, what would you say about this new Indo-Pacific strategy that could persist no matter what kind of regime South Korea might have down the road? That might sort of question and comments for Dr. Choi's presentation. And for Dr. Ryan Clark, I have 2 questions. What do you think is the impact of sort of the improved Korea-Japan relationship on the future of the Quad? in the case of Quad, we have heard that inside Quad, there were some kind of internal debates about the new membership, new expansion for the future of the Quad. And as we know, we have made some sort of improvement in terms of the relationship between Japan and South Korea. Of course, we have some domestic controversies surrounding the Yoon administration's approaches and strategies toward Japan. But put that aside, what could be the impact? What could be the kind of new relationship between the two countries, South Korea and Japan, on the future of the Quad? That's my curiosity. And the second question for Dr. Clark is, there seems to be sort of the mini-lateralism working or kind of sort of introduced by the United States in the region. Kind of mini-lateralism might be not a sort of familiar term for the IR scholars, and or the United States has had some sort of alliance strategies or multilateralism or bilateralism. So this so-called mini-lateralism seems to be unprecedented way of thinking and way of pushing for new cooperation and new developments in the region. Of course, there is the United States at the center of this mini-lateralism, like the kind of different layers of mini groups, kind of the AUKUS, Quad, and Chip 4, and other sort of group-based approaches to the peaceful solutions in the region led by the United States. So my question for Dr. Clark is, do you believe that this is the kind of effective way of thinking, or this mini-lateralism led by the United States could persist in the long term? So what's your thoughts about this mini-lateralism as a new way of cooperation in the region pushed by the United States? And finally, for Dr. Jamil, I think my question has a lot to do with my previous question for Dr. Choi. I'm quite curious about the ASEAN's responses or kind of feeling toward a kind of a series of Indo-Pacific strategies pushed by the United States or laid out by the new administration in South Korea or first termed by the Japanese government. So what is your kind of, what is your responses inside the ASEAN? Are you kind of, I mean, quite frankly, cynical about this kind of new brands of Indo-Pacific strategies by the United States, Japan, and South Korea? Or are you kind of quite seriously considering this sort of ever-evolving patterns and types of Indo-Pacific strategies by the countries outside the ASEAN? So I'm kind of curious about how you kind of receive this changing sort of points and policies in the name of the Indo-Pacific strategies. So that's kind of my 2 cents for each presenter. And if I have about 2 minutes, I can share what I'm thinking about the U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Indo-Pacific strategies. I have only 2 slides. I'm a scholar who is studying about domestic politics of foreign policy making, especially in the United States. So let me introduce some thoughts about kind of this so-called countering China. The media and the conventional wisdom, according to the media and according to the conventional wisdom, there seems to be sort of bipartisan support on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for the concept of countering China. But when we kind of deep down to the real dynamics or real practices of countering China in the United States, we can see some kind of differences between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And how domestic politics or American politics of countering China is working is heavily affecting the way we respond to the United States foreign policy. The first difference seems to be that the Trump administration has used executive orders only. So there was no real room left for the US Congress to get involved in the making of Indo-Pacific strategies or countering China policies. But during the Biden administration, Biden himself is a kind of a classical politician who spent about 36 years in the US Senate and 8 years in the White House as the vice president. So during the Biden administration period, there seems to be some lawmaking politics as a main driving force for countering China. The second distinction I could make is that the Trump has only centered on trade issues, not necessarily technologies or supply chains. But on the contrary, the Biden administration is kind of quite focusing on science and technology as well. So there seems to be the kind of policy orientation differences in there. And finally, domestically speaking and electoral politics wide, the Asian American voters and Asian hate crimes are the still kind of big issues, especially for the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. Maybe the Republican Party and the Trump administration back then was not necessarily paying attention to these Asian American voters related kind of implications by pushing China away. My final slide is, here is what I'm thinking about kind of domestic and partisan politics of China policy making in the United States. As you know, the United States has two-party system, so we have 4 different scenarios where we could kind of categorically sort of summarize where the partisan politics exist: bipartisan, partisan, wedge issue, and cross-cutting issue. So human rights, climate crisis, Chinese labor in the 19th century. And the thing is that the right down corner of this cross-cutting politics seems to be a current status or not. That seems to be kind of my sort of puzzle later on, but I have spent too much time. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Interesting questions and comments. Now I would like to open the floor for the discussion, but I would like to ask particularly 2 audience for today's webinar. I found that at least 2 former South Korean ambassadors to ASEAN region is participating, joining now. So I would like to ask Ambassador Sungnam, who served ASEAN, and also Ambassador Hyun, who served Malaysia, for their comments after a few minutes later. Before that, as a moderator, let me also pose some questions to each panelist. Dr. Choi, you mentioned that Yoon government's Indo-Pacific strategy, one of the main focuses is how can we align better with the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So, as far as I understand, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy initially drafted by North American Bureau of the MOFA. So it already indicates that South Korean, one of the South Korea's focus has been how can South Korea align its policy with that of the United States. But if that's the case, how China will view this government's Indo-Pacific strategy? Will they view this as some kind of hostility against them? That's my question. And secondly, Dr. Clark, you talked about Quad and AUKUS. And as far as I know, China views both of these mechanisms as some sort of Asian NATO, and they strongly oppose both ideas. Code may be a little bit different because India has some different opinion about militarization of this group, but AUKUS has more specifically has security-related focus by simply looking at the fact that Australia will be given nuclear-powered submarine. So, do you believe Quad and AUKUS will be useful or more destabilizing in the Indo-Pacific regional order in the coming years? And Dr. Jamil, you talked about one of the key features in South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy and ASEAN principle is the inclusiveness. Will this principle of inclusiveness include China as well? And also, you said China will be one of the challenging factor because, for example, if South Korea try to pursue rule-based international order, that rule may sometimes collide with China's rule as well. So how do you perceive that inclusiveness will work with China in the Pacific region? So that's my question. So I would like to give just a few minutes for each panelist to respond first, and then I'll ask Dr. Im Sungnam and Ambassador Hyun for their comments. Okay, who will respond first? Dr. Choi?
Okay, thank you for a wonderful question. I think it will further clarify how Indo-Pacific strategy of Korea can implement in the real stage. Yes, you are right that we changed the name and the major contents of our foreign policy from regime to regimes and from party to party. But one thing I can say for clear is that New Southern policy has left its mark on regional strategy for sure, and it's mostly there is kind of shared perception and importance about ASEAN region, and as well as the threat perception and Korea's position towards the dynamic international order. For instance, the importance of US's alliance and threat perception from China, and also the perception that a threat was as well as the opportunity from the Indo-Pacific region. So all those kind of regions that I elaborated as a background of Indo-Pacific strategy, I think is to some extent are shared from party to party, from both democratic and progressive. So there is some kind of rather solid foundation that we can pursue our Indo-Pacific strategy. Maybe, but the next government will change the name, but I think we are moving to this direction that Korea has to be more responsible actor and should contribute more to the sustainability and peace in the region. So this direction is for sure. But of course, there is some differences. For instance, how much we can pursue our principle based on norms and rules and human rights, freedom, and so on, which means that how we can balance, this is issued by President Lee many times, balance our value and our national interest. So previous government is emphasized much the pragmatic interest of Korea, but now the current government has putting more emphasis on value side. So we have to navigate through this value and interest very wisely. So this is very, very important and very difficult task, as also raised by Dr. Jamil, Professor Jamil. Yes, rule-based order and South China Sea, Taiwan Strait matters would be some kind of milestone that how we can deal with those kind of emerging issues in the region. So my first answer to Professor Hall's question was first in partly yes, but we have still tasks to tackle. And secondly to President Lee, of course, it is evident that all things under the name of Indo-Pacific is perceived very much threatening to China. China does not want to have this Indo-Pacific name. It has Asia-Pacific, and all names under Indo-Pacific is directly influenced by the United States. But it was very interesting to see how China reacted when we announced our new Indo-Pacific strategy. Their approach was kind of very much prudential, and they were saving their hawkish words toward our strategy, and they acknowledged that our strategy was trying to balance, had a balancing strategy. So it signals that even though it is evident Korea was aligned with the United States, China acknowledged that Korea still tries to balance between China and the US and want to have some more space to maneuver its strategic autonomy. And also in this context, we devoted one full sentence for our mutually beneficial relationship between Korea and China. So still there are a lot of things to be done to really implement how to improve our relations with China. But anyhow, I think we had a really kind of satisfying start for this facet. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Clark.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the questions. I think with the Quad, of course, there's a lot of activity that's going on behind the scenes, underneath the surface, whatever term you want to use. But there's still a fundamental question: is what is it? Is it an Asian NATO? And I think the answer is no, because if you think about NATO itself, I mean, for example, if you have a situation, if Russia engaged in active hostilities against Lithuania, for example, then soldiers in Denmark would, in principle, would need to be ready to go and take immense risk to defend Lithuania from Russian aggression. Even more of an extreme formulation, if, for example, the issue that Turkey, which is a NATO member, has, the border issue that Turkey has with Syria, in principle, if you had an escalation of this, you would need to be, for example, a country like Belgium or France would need to be ready to deploy troops to Turkey to defend Turkey from what they would term Syrian aggression. So when you think about, and that within the NATO structure itself poses all types of structural challenges. So when you think about how difficult that is to maintain, in Europe and in North America and also with Australia, I think it becomes clear how unworkable an Asian NATO model is, especially through the current form of the Quad. Again, because India is just it's very difficult to interact with India. It's very difficult to engage in strategic initiatives that are going to hold over time. The track record of trying to do these types of initiatives with India is not inspiring. So I think there's going to be, of course, some successes, but it's not going to result or translate into an Asian NATO type of alliance structure, largely on the account of the fact that India just has too many complexities and free variables to account for. And I don't see any evidence that there's any effort being made to deal with that. AUKUS is a different situation. And I think, of course, with the improved relations, the relatively improved relations between South Korea and Japan, that's a different story, because then you can imagine an AUKUS++ model where you have the US, UK, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, that is a tight, compact treaty alliance structure with mutual defense treaties underpinning it. That's a more concrete functional structure. And I think to answer your question about the question about escalatory potential, I think, of course, we're already seeing evidence of this. And I'm speculating a little bit on this. I don't have links into Jungman High, and I don't pretend to. But of course, if you're sitting in Beijing and you see these new structures forming around you, one of the things that you're going to do likely is to test them and to discover through testing and prodding where the boundaries are and how serious these new organizations or these new structures actually are. And there's only one way in the real world, there's only one way to find out, and that's to test them. And I think so to answer your question, it's not such a positive response, but I think this is going to prove escalatory over the medium term, and we're already seeing evidence of that happening. This concept of minilateralism, I have to confess, I'm not so familiar with it. But what I would say in principle is that a country like the U.S. that has the commitments and, frankly speaking, the liabilities that it has on its plate in the Indo-Pacific, you can engage in minilateralism or very localized diplomacy to put fires out, to deal with localized problems like the insurgency in the southern Philippines, for example, or helping to build capacity to deal with Pacific Ring of Fire issues and things of that nature, of course. But a country like the U.S. doesn't have the luxury of only doing that. It has to be tied into a broader, I don't want to say grand strategy, but a broader architecture and a broader strategic framework because of the liabilities that the U.S. carries. A country like Australia, for example, has the ability, the luxury, frankly speaking, of being able to do more localized or minilateral type of initiatives because they don't carry the overall liabilities. But a country like the U.S. has to think about everything that it does and how it ties back to its Indo-Pacific concept and its alliance structures. It's just the nature of the post World War II order. Thank you.
Oh, she's not here. Professor Jamil.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. So I'll begin by answering Prof. So Jungkun's question on whether how ASEAN actually responds to the series of Indo-Pacific strategy emerging in the region and around the world. I think ASEAN response remain ambivalent in terms of various Indo-Pacific strategy formulated by different countries globally. And this actually is because of how we really define the word Indo-Pacific, right? Because this one term, it has many meanings. So this is one thing why we remain ambivalent. And then another thing is that the orientation of our Indo-Pacific strategy. Many of these Indo-Pacific strategy, they have strategic, very strong strategic sense or agenda in it. For ASEAN, what really matters to us is that we want to preserve peace and stability in the Southeast Asian region. So what we did is that we came up with our own version of Indo-Pacific thought or document called the AOIP. And this is how we actually present our collective voice or view in the emerging geopolitical realities in the region at the moment. And I think it is also worth highlighting or mentioning that the AOIP is not a document dominated by strategic sense or strategic interest, but it is just a guideline to guide countries on how we should preserve or how we should cooperate and to preserve peace and stability in the region. So I think that's how ASEAN basically is responding to the emerging or changing dynamics in the region. And then questions on the principle of inclusiveness or inclusivity, whether or not this inclusivity actually include China. I think, yes, the term inclusiveness or inclusivity, actually, I think for South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, this is actually largely directed or to China. So we can see in the report, other than calling China as a key partner to preserve, to achieve prosperity and peace in the region, it also says that we are willing to work with countries with different political systems. So we don't have many countries in the region with different political system, and the major one and the biggest one would be China. So this, for me, my interpretation at least, is actually about China, on how South Korea want to enhance and improve its relationship with China, right? And to avoid upsetting China to a certain extent, because by announcing this Indo-Pacific strategy, some Chinese or some people in Beijing, they might perceive this as a strategic tilt towards Washington, and they might not like it. But by having these clauses and these sentences in the document, it actually shows that South Korea is willing to work with other countries as well, including China. And this is actually in line with the AOIP, because for ASEAN, we also trying to showcase to the world that we are really willing to work with every countries and every powers in the region, including China. And then whether or not South Korea can work with China under this inclusivity, if our rules collided or clashes, right? I don't really have the answer for this. That's the reason why I think this is the major issue that both Seoul and China, as well as ASEAN, we need to figure out how can Seoul actually stay firm and keep their words. But what I can be sure is that we need to be really careful in dealing with China, mainly because of one thing, Chinese economic might, right? Because for many countries in the region, including South Korea and ASEAN, Malaysia, and etc., China is a very important trading partner for us. And for many of us, they are even the largest trading partner. And they have been showering the region with a lot of economic incentive. So many ASEAN countries, in order to avoid upsetting China, we tend to play a low profile, we adopt a low profile approach in dealing with China, even in contentious issue like the South China Sea and etc. I'm not sure whether this kind of approach works for Korea as well, but I just think that we need to be really careful in dealing with this. So I think how Korea and China can actually work together under the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy it still remains to be seen. And I might be wrong, so I would be glad or I'll appreciate if some of our Korean colleagues can actually offer some insights on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I may pose the two complicated question. We have only about 6 minutes left, but as I mentioned, Ambassador Im Sungnam, are you still there?
Okay, I will try to be brief, especially because I'll be also making some comments in the second session where we will be discussing Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. Number one, when I look at the Korean version of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I first thought that it's a collection of a comprehensive collection of regional policies. But after the second reading of the Indo-Pacific strategy of Korea, I think in essence, it's the policy declaration of how to deal with China in the region. And as already indicated by previous speakers, Korea has clearly identified China as a key partner in the region's peace and prosperity. So we want to work together with China. I mean, the Yoon government is also interested in working together with China. That's number one. And number two, when I look at the AOIP, it's a very basic document of the principles. And it's like a skeleton of the policy declarations. So I know there are differences among the ASEAN member states about the Indo-Pacific region, but I do hope that in the coming years, ASEAN come up with more concrete action programs to flesh out the AOIP so that they can figure out what to do more specifically for promoting regional peace and prosperity. Last but not least, especially because this webinar is being sponsored by Sejong as well as EAI, I believe there is a huge similarity in the strategic environment of Korea and Singapore. Both countries have important ties with both China and the US, and both Korea and Singapore are surrounded by the big powers. So down the road, I hope, especially between Korea and Singapore, we can have a more in-depth strategic conversation, not necessarily between the two governments, but between the think tanks, so that we can figure out what the middle powers can do to better to improve the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific region. So I'll make a stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Ambassador Hyun Suk, you still there?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate into this very meaningful academic event. Frankly speaking, I wasn't prepared. I was eating my brunch, but I have got response to Nuru Shahana and Jamil, Professor Jamil, because she raised the issue, the comparison between NSP and then CASI. My understanding is that the NSP was it was ASEAN policy, but CASI is more like regional policy, more encompassing, and I think the major important element is that it's more robust role of Korea in strategic and security issues in this region. And my understanding is that this direction is correct and legitimate. I had a chance to talk with a group of Southeast Asian experts on Korea, either Korea or Northeast Asia, on the achievements and the limitations of NSP. And then the most striking comment from them is that NSP lack of the blueprint, Korea's role in strategic issue in the region. So they strongly urge that Korea needs a more active and robust role in region's strategic issues such as South China Sea and so on. So the CASI is more encompassing regional policy and then have advisable direction. That's my understanding. I better stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's almost time, and well, I think we have a good conversation in session one. Because I'm working mostly on global order these days, from my perspective, I would like to characterize the current global order as a two opposing trends. One is the fragmentation. Another one is the formation of the new blocs or some sort of coalition. So if these trends continue, maybe we'll see more and more hostile or increasingly more difficult situation to handle global issues. So in this sense, I found the value of Korea-ASEAN solidarity and cooperation in that we can work together to moderate the negative impact of such fragmentation and also formation of bloc, whatever it may be called. So I hope that Korea and ASEAN will continue to work on this issue. And of course, expert contribution will be quite important to shape the policy of both Korea and ASEAN countries. So let me conclude the session and thank you all the panelists and good presentation and question and discussion. Thank you. Let's have a 5-minute break.
Let's come back to our second session for today's webinar. I think we've had very good discussion for the first session, which focused on the geopolitics and the relationship among big powers. I think this is a very important topic. But I do think that the second topic could be even more important, especially to this region, because we know that actually these days Southeast Asia provides a kind of new options, even for big powers. As we know that even for example, relationship with China is still very important. But when countries like Korea developing relationship with China, they also think about certain kind of risks associated with the Indo-Pacific strategy or the geopolitics. So Southeast Asia these days provides a kind of option to almost all powers, even including China. So I do think that these days this region is embracing a probably the best era for its development. So that's why Southeast Asia is getting more and more important. So our second topic is about KASI, Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. I do think that it's a kind of upgrade from the new Southern policy of the Moon's administration. And we have 4 distinguished panelists who will look at this issue from different angles, from their own country perspectives, followed by Ambassador Lim's comments. So I think each of the panelists will have about 10 minutes. I think it's calculated by AI. Yeah, so we have to stick to this 10 minutes rule. We do not have much time. I'll be very strict on the timing. So without further ado, may I invite Dr. Resi Kurata-Aini from the University of Indonesia to share her view on the Indonesian perspective. Dr. Aini, please.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Gang Chen. Firstly, I would like to deliver my gratitude to East Asian Institute and Sejong Institute for conducting this webinar. I'm Resi Kurata-Aini from University of Indonesia, and I will discuss about how Indonesia perceives KASI. Okay, let me share my presentation first. Okay. President Yoon Suk Yeol chose the Asian Korea Summit to announce for the first time the Korea's Indo-Pacific Strategy and Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative in November 2022. Then he reiterated at the side event of the G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia. This gesture shows that Korea acknowledges the significance of ASEAN and Indonesia for its Indo-Pacific strategy. Indonesia is the key driver of ASEAN and holds the chairmanship for 2023. Thus, Indonesia's response to KASI will significantly influence how ASEAN bring it on and determine the success of KASI. On this occasion, I would like to discuss how Indonesia perceives KASI, which will be assessed from 3 aspects. The first one is from domestic politics and priorities, geopolitical dynamics, and middle power diplomacy. And first, I will have a glance on Korea-Indonesia bilateral relations. This year, Indonesia and South Korea commemorate their 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties. And this year seems to be a tremendous one for the development of their relations. The status is special strategic partner, meaning that the cooperation has been translated into tangible actions in various aspects, such as security, maritime, infrastructures, and many others. At the beginning of 2023, Indonesia and Korea also wrapped their comprehensive economic partnership agreement, which marked a record as the quickest negotiation successfully wrapped throughout the history of Indonesia's economic partnership agreement. And how Indonesia's perspective on KASI. The first one, we'll have a look on Indonesia's domestic politics and priorities. Partnership with Korea are in line with 2 out of 5 aspects of Jokowi's working priority agendas, which are boosting infrastructure development and attracting investment. Indonesia welcomes infrastructure partnership with South Korea as it helps widen Indonesia's options amid business competition between the Japanese and Chinese consortium in LRT construction projects in Indonesia. Since taking office, Jokowi has visited Seoul for 5 times, with economic talks dominating his agenda. The amount of trade and investment kept going upward since their status elevation into special strategic partner in 2017. Another mutually beneficial strategic sector is on defense industry. South Korea is among top tiers in military submarine construction and arms producers in Asia, while Indonesia has agenda to strengthen its defense sector through military procurement and develop the domestic defense industry. Indonesia and Korea currently have at least 2 current projects of submarine construction and fighter aircraft procurement. And linked with KASI, it brings to the table the economic and security priorities by putting forward the commitment to build a free, peace, and prosperous Indo-Pacific through strategic cooperation with ASEAN. Therefore, the convergence of economic and security interests between Jakarta and Seoul may create greater room for collaboration that shall boost their partnership through KASI. And in dealing with geopolitical tension, they shared common interests but with different positions. South Korea and Indonesia deal with similar strategic dilemma due to heightened tension of the US and China's competition. Both have interlinking interests in safeguarding the regional stability since it is the required condition to accommodate their interests. This might be optimized if they work on to specify this action through KASI. However, they both have different positions in alignment. At the beginning of its launching, many were skeptical of South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, which was seen as Korea's bold alignment with the United States. Many even assumed that KASI was an attempt to neutralize Korea's action by engaging with ASEAN, which has more neutral image. Nonetheless, if we have closer look at the Korea Indo-Pacific strategy, actually it is quite moderate by aiming the commitment to build free, peace, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. The highlighted difference with previous Moon Jae-in initiative is that the aspect of security has been included by embedded in Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. It is also noteworthy that South Korea will always see the security of Korean Peninsula as priority that affects its foreign policy, while Indonesia, through ASEAN, confirms ASEAN centrality as priority in dealing with geopolitical tension. And this means that the two has shared interests, but with different position and priorities. And the last one, I will talk about KASI from the aspect of Korea and Indonesia middle power strategy. They both are two middle powers which try to expand their influence through cooperation with other countries and regions. As part of their middle power strategy, it is crucial for Indonesia and Korea to boost their engagement at the global stage. And ASEAN might be the best option for the two, since ASEAN is able to engage all levels of powers without suspicion. ASEAN has been the main diplomacy vehicle for Indonesia and significant dialogue partner for Korea. ASEAN links KASI to support the ASEAN existing initiative, which is the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. Indonesia put its best effort to promote ASEAN as centrality, particularly amid this escalated tension of great power politics in Indo-Pacific. And Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN this year will be a great opportunity for Indonesia's leadership and middle power diplomacy. The ASEAN theme this year is ASEAN Matters Epicentrum of Ground, which reflects the priorities for boosting economic sector post-COVID-19 and ASEAN centrality in dealing with current Indo-Pacific geopolitical tension. And Indonesia is the initiator of ASEAN Outlook, and Indo-Pacific is welcoming collaboration with South Korea through KASI that should be linked back to support ASEAN centrality. And despite different perspective on KASI, one thing for sure is that KASI is a middle power diplomacy of South Korea, aiming to engage ASEAN as strategic partner. And KASI is a step forward because it is already included the strategic security aspect. And Jakarta looks favorably on KASI as its first principle fit in with Jokowi's priority development that aims to safeguard the security, the regional stability, and Indonesia's middle power diplomacy. And however, the difference between the position of Korea and Indonesia is undeniable. Indonesia maintains its independent and active foreign policy principle and optimize the ASEAN as its main vehicle for multilateral diplomacy while maintaining its centrality. And the operationalization of KASI into specific tangible action plan is a good step forward that allow KASI not to be misinterpreted as just for Korea's attempt to neutralize its policy of being bold to its alignment with the US Indo-Pacific concept. And I think Korea and ASEAN states should also follow up this implementation to be effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amy, for sharing with us your perspectives on the middle power strategies of both Indonesia and Korea. And I think we come back to Korea again because we started from Southeast Asian end. Professor Wang Yi, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. And it's great to see a lot of friends from Southeast Asia. I'd like to make a short presentation. I'd like to make 3 specific points up front. First, I think KASI represents ROK's continued interest and commitment to forge stronger ties with Southeast Asia. So you have strong element of continuity in Korea's approach toward Southeast Asia here. Secondly, I think if they implement KASI as they hope, KASI would be a much stronger, more comprehensive, and more powerful initiative than the previous Korean ASEAN policies, including NSP. But it remains to be seen whether Seoul can live up to the aspirations and pledges made in KASI. And my third point is that there would be a lot of challenges for Korean government to go on with this new initiative. But I think one of the most daunting challenges would be China challenge. I mean, we are already beginning to see the signs of Chinese displeasure, discontent about Korea's new Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, for example, when President Yoon made his comments in his interview with American media about Taiwan, Chinese spokesperson from the foreign ministry made a very strong comment, and you have some exchanges of harsh comments. So I think the China would be the biggest challenge. First, I'd like to make two brief comments about Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, if you look at the document, which was unveiled last December, there is no specific reference to China. Of course, there are only 3 references to China when the document says that China is the key partner, when they talk about the importance of trilateral summit among Korea, Japan, and China. Well, I think you have to read between the lines and the document in broader strategic context. I think one of the key messages that Korean government wanted to send out with the release of this Indo-Pacific document is that this document has nothing to do with China. So the main reason for South Korea to initiate new Indo-Pacific strategy has nothing to do with China. That's the message. That's the political message that Seoul wanted to send out. But in fact, if you look at the substantive nature of the document, right, it's all about China. I mean, if you look at the Seoul's document, they talk about all the things that China would oppose without directly mentioning China. So this is, I think this reflects the kind of strategic vulnerabilities and political sensitivities that South Korea is located, right? We are next to China. If you look at the military balance, I mean, Korea is not in a position to antagonize or pinpoint China. So I think this is a Korean way of revealing its strategic identity. In the document, Seoul made it clear that we have strategic interest in maintaining and bolstering rules-based order. And also we are committed to align and work with like-minded countries. So substantively, I think China would not like this kind of a new Seoul's posture, right? So that's why they included as the first principle of the strategy, the inclusiveness, right? But the principle of inclusiveness, from my individual perspective, is not the key factor that define Seoul's new Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the phrase that China is key partner and the first principle of the strategy, I mean the inclusiveness principle, I think that's kind of just a diplomatic management tool deal with China, I think. And also, a lot of observers say that Seoul's new Indo-Pacific strategy is kind of decoupling strategy from China. I don't think so. We are not in a position to decouple China. How can you think Korea can decouple from China? It's impossible. We have to, whether we like it or not, I think we have to deal with China. We have to live with China. So it is not a decoupling strategy, I think. I think the Seoul's new strategy is kind of a new approach to set a new terms of engagement with China. So, for example, the very fact that Seoul announced in the Indo-Pacific strategy is that we are not anymore going to follow the principal approach of previous government, so-called the balanced diplomacy approach, right? So you try to strike a balance, strategic balance between Washington and Beijing. But in our new approach from this conservative government, the focus is not balance. You follow what you need to do based on your national interest, strategic interest, and political values. And then you have to deal with the differences with China. I think this is a different approach. So in that regard, I think there is a radical departure in terms of strategic thinking with this current government from the previous government. So I think this broader Indo-Pacific strategy and the strategic thinking that is undergirding this strategy is kind of providing the basis for our new approach toward ASEAN, which is KASI. Well, actually, the government has not yet officially released a document detailing KASI. In fact, they've already finalized the roadmap of KASI. And in fact, a couple of days ago, I found that there is an English explanatory note about KASI on the Korean MOFA's website. But I mean, the problem is, I mean, this document, right? I mean, the 8-page document detailing the contents of the KASI, this is not uploaded in the English website of MOFA Korea. It's in Korean website. So I think the international scholars who are keen on this are hard to find. So maybe later on, I will in the chatting screen, I will put the website link of this document. So if you click on this, then you could directly get the PDF of this document. So the Korean government has finalized all of the roadmap of documents. So if you look at this document, there are details of this. So my reading of this document is that there is a strong element of continuity. There are a high level of overlapping of what we have been doing with Southeast Asia under NSP and the Korean government. So I mean, as one of the commentators in the previous session noted, you have to consider the domestic politics of South Korea, which we have singleton presidency, right? So I mean, even if you come from the same party, whether it is progressive or conservative, there is a strong political incentive to differentiate yourself from the predecessor, right? So in terms of substantive content, even if the policy is the same, you want to use a different brand name, right? So you can count on me that there is a strong element of continuity in substantive sense. But there is a fundamental difference. In the previous approach toward the Southeast Asia, Korean perspective is mostly economic. If you look at NSP, even if we have 3 pillars, people, prosperity, and peace, most of the programs, NSP programs, focused on economic and functional cooperation. But here in KASI, there is a strong emphasis on strategic cooperation with AMS, ASEAN member countries. So you have different strategic kind of priority. So if you look at the document, right, I mean, there are a lot of issues, a lot of programs regarding the strategic cooperation with ASEAN countries, like the maritime cooperation, the defense ministers meeting regularized the defense ministers meeting every year, and the lots of issues. I don't want to go into detail. So anyhow, so given what we have been doing with Southeast Asia in trade and investment area, we will do it. We will also engage with Southeast Asian partners in development cooperation areas. We even would double the cooperation fund. So we will have more things coming under this cost spread. But in addition to that, we will try to, under the CASI, the Seoul government made a strong pledge and commitment to go forward with the strategic cooperation. So I think this is one of the key differences. And finally, I think challenges. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is China. Of course, you have a lot of challenges. I mean, there are domestic challenges with this Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, the President Yoon, his domestic political standing is not very sound. His approval rate is just around 30%, especially since his visit to Tokyo. His remarks and what he has done with Kishida really is kind of detrimental to his domestic political standing. So, and also we have the general election coming next year. So if the ruling party is still going to be a minority party like the present situation, I think there aren't, we will not have a strong domestic political momentum to go with these ambitious goals and commitments on the Indo-Pacific strategy. So in that regard, I think to the extent CASI has a strong strategic element, defense cooperation and things like that, then that would be China would be, how to deal with China would be a biggest challenge. For example, I mean, because you want to have a different strategy from the NSP. For example, one of the issues is the South China Sea. I mean, as far as I know, Korean government has never expressed a concern about what situations of China Sea in its official document. For example, if you look at the charge statement from the PMC, the meeting between the ASEAN Foreign Minister meeting and Korean counterparts, in Korean document, you have never you can never find a word like a concern or deep concern about the situation in South China Sea. Whereas other dialogue partners document, you have expressions like that. So Seoul now announced that it will try to go with the Southeast Asian partners with strategic cooperation, try to be an active player in the security situations in the region rather than just a fence-sitting observer. Then you need to make a difference. So it remains to be seen how Seoul would go with this. I mean, for example, in this year we have the foreign ministers meeting and ARF and other diplomatic forums. So I think it remains to be seen how far Seoul can go with this new kind of the position and approaches. And also, I think there are a lot of difficulties in maritime cooperation. We have been providing decommissioned ships, providing technology support for the enhancement of maritime capacities of Southeast Asian countries. But I don't know how far we can go with that. So there are a lot of ambitions, aspirations, but still we have domestic and external constraints. So in that regard, I think Seoul and the Southeastern partners should work hard to make some tangible outcomes in this regard. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cho. I think probably the government wants the people in Southeast Asia to learn Korean language. That's why the document's not in English yet, or they are too busy with some other things. Yeah. But my suggestion actually to Korea is that you mentioned that just now Seoul has been talking a lot that could offend China. I think one suggestion could be that you can keep talking one thing that will not affect China definitely, which will be the cooperation between Korea and the Southeast Asia. Yeah, I do think that these days middle powers, many middle powers, there's no reason for them to offend the big powers, be it China or the United States. Yeah, there's no reason to do that. I think one clever strategy would be to enhance cooperation among the middle powers themselves. That would be a good no regret option. Yeah. Okay, I think let's come back to local again. We have my colleague, Mr. Gordon Kang, as the third speaker. He will share with us his views on a Singaporean perspective. Yeah, Gordon, please.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Right. Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for coming to the webinar today. It is my pleasure to speak to you about the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, or KASI, from a Singapore perspective. As two like-minded nations, Singapore and South Korea share many aligned interests and individual characteristics, which offer strong incentives for mutually beneficial cooperation. Many opportunities exist for both countries to leverage on in terms of maybe perhaps advanced innovation and manufacturing in AI, digitalization, and semiconductor chip technology. Additionally, shared strategic and security concerns, as several presenters have mentioned, such as US-China tensions, North Korea's ballistic missile testing, and the global effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, force both countries to consider how they can deepen bilateral relations and mitigate the effects of supply chain disruptions, economic uncertainty, and global isolationism. So with both countries prioritizing similar strategic principles, it creates a strong foundation for cooperation on mutual interests of international law, economics, and security issues. So South Korea's KASI, under its Global Pivotal State Initiative and Indo-Pacific Strategy, or the IPS, is thus very welcome to build on its positive partnerships with ASEAN and with Singapore. So an important aspect to distinguish, however, is how ROK-Singapore cooperation would develop specifically as part of its tailored approach through KASI. I aim to speak today to provide a short overview of where we are at in terms of ROK-Singapore bilateral relations, as well as potential opportunities and challenges. Firstly, let's review how Singapore-ROK bilateral relations have evolved. Over the past 5 years, with the initiation of the New Southern Policy, or the NSP, bilateral relations have clearly strengthened. President Moon Jae-in's state visit to Singapore in July 2018 was the first such state visit from the ROK to Singapore in 15 years. 6 MOUs were signed. These covered a broad range of shared areas, from the environment, free trade, smart grids, sectors related to the fourth industrial revolution, SMEs, and economic investment. So prior to that visit, there was also an MOU signed for research on immune disease and cancer as well, so public health issues. President Moon also visited Singapore again in November 2018 for the 33rd ASEAN Summit and related meetings. And in November 2019, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong went to South Korea for an official visit to Seoul and attended the ASEAN ROK Commemorative Summit in Busan. 4 MOUs were signed there on standards and conformance, pharmaceutics, smart cities, and cybersecurity. Over the course of COVID-19, both leaders have also met frequently through ASEAN-led meetings, and significant economic projects have also opened in this period. Now, with the inauguration of President Yoon Suk Yeol, bilateral ties have continued to deepen since President Halimah Yacob attended the inauguration of President Yoon on 10th May last year, as well as a state banquet dinner and a bilateral meeting. On 10th June, South Korea's Minister of National Defense, Sejong met Singapore's Defense Minister Ng Eng Hen on the sidelines of the 19th Shangri-La Dialogue, where 2 MOUs were signed on various areas of defense cooperation and media production. In July, South Korea's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Park Jin, met Prime Minister Lee in Singapore and was also hosted the dinner by his counterpart, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan. In August and October, as you can see, there were key business projects launched, but significantly, key recent events had to do with the digital economy, where South Korea and Singapore signed the landmark Korea-Singapore Digital Partnership Agreement on 21st November 2022. This came into force on 14th January this year and is Singapore's 4th digital economy agreement and the first with any Asian country. Finally, Singapore and South Korea also signed an MOU on 6th December 2022 on AI collaboration. So from this long list of events, we can ascertain not just that bilateral ties remain strong despite COVID-19, but also a consistent and reassuring progression of partnerships, despite COVID-19 and significant geopolitical events. With President Yoon's announcement of South Korea's new IPS and KASI at the 23rd ASEAN ROK Summit on 11th November last year, it is clear that ASEAN and its member states are now increasingly more key partners of South Korea in its pivot towards greater strategic clarity rather than ambiguity under the Global Pivotal State Initiative. While there were previous worries that KASI might not emerge as an upgrade of the NSP, recent ROK summits and events with Singapore have substantiated ROK's intent to strengthen bilateral relations and also through ASEAN's regional architecture. This is, on principle, KASI likewise also promises a more comprehensive extension from NSP. This is particularly, as Prof. Choi has mentioned, with the more detailed official publication of KASI's document on South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs English language website too, actually. So I found it just yesterday. It's published apparently on 21st April, but I just saw it yesterday and thus, amended my presentation slightly to reflect it. So in it highlights 8 core lines of effort, right? So thus, the question I aim to answer is how and in what areas can ROK Singapore bilateral cooperation develop through KASI? Firstly, with the IPS's focus to encompass more than just sectors of economy and trade, security cooperation in its traditional and non-traditional forms is a field that will likely be of key focus. Of these, alongside KASI's commitment to align with the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the AOIP's 4 listed priorities of cooperation, maritime cooperation would possibly be of key focus. That is a key concern of Singapore's foreign policy. Singapore is clearly a major maritime hub, and it's one of the busiest ports in the world. In collaboration with international partners through ASEAN to discuss maritime security issues and coordinate them, such as on piracy, terrorism, and environmental pollution, is crucial. Bilateral cooperation with South Korea has also occurred in the past. As you can see, 2019, joint training exercise through ADMM+, and the 2021 bilateral MOU. More clearly, however, bilateral ties have already expanded in this sector early in President Yoon's tenure, with the Defense Cooperation MOU signed in June last year, covering areas of maritime security, but also cybersecurity, among others. So in this vein, on top of what is listed in the AOIP, cybersecurity is another key concern that should see more progress in the future. Singapore's contemporary cybersecurity concerns include the growing threat of cyber attacks from both state and non-state actors, the rise of ransomware, and the use of AI and machine learning in cyber attacks. There's also a need to secure critical infrastructure such as the financial sector, healthcare, and transportation in Singapore. So in this vein, Singapore and South Korea have signed a cybersecurity MOU in November 2019. With the Korea-Singapore Digital Partnership Agreement now in force, there should also be strong interest to cooperate, be it bilaterally or through ASEAN mechanisms, to enhance cybersecurity practices and standards, advance voluntary shared norms, and to develop inter-country cyber capacities. Secondly, there's also much room for strategic coordination to develop. Both countries are not immune to regional geopolitics, no less with US-Chinese tensions and more. And Singapore, with its small size and lack of natural resources, has long recognized the importance of a stable and peaceful international environment. So in this respect, KASI will see both Singapore and South Korea continue to enhance their strong participation in ASEAN regional architecture through ASEAN-related summits. With the growth of multilateral groupings, as other presenters have mentioned as well in Southeast Asia, it may be possible that either country increasingly subscribes to such ventures where diplomatically supportable by ASEAN for the purposes of specific aspects of norms and order generation or for strategic purposes. Bilaterally, there's also high-level dialogue and policy exchanges, be it at a track 1 or 2 level, that should see continued expansion. Of course, these are all ongoing. For example, with our dialogue today and past events between EAI and KNDA of the Embassy of South Korea in Singapore. There's also events earlier this year, as I listed in this slide. By extension, pertaining to the Korea Peninsula, North Korea's ballistic missile testing has also been a key area of concern for Singapore. It should be an important aspect for KASI to note that in terms of engagement, Singapore is an especially effective dialogue partner to engage with North Korea in the appropriate circumstances. Singapore has access to a position of neutrality and objectivity between Pyongyang, Seoul, and ASEAN, and does not share long-standing historical burdens with key players such as China and the US. Singapore can leverage on its position to act as a diplomatic bridge, while also strictly complying with UN Security Council sanctions. Singapore also has past ties to the DPRK to work with in terms of trade, healthcare affiliation with the Kim family, and also with humanitarian aid. Yet, while South Korea supports efforts for ASEAN and individual member states to play a constructive role in engaging North Korea, Singapore's close enforcement of UN sanctions on North Korea is key to maintaining Singapore's foreign policy reputation for its reliability and trustworthiness. Thirdly, Future industries and collective global issues provide many opportunities for ROK-Singapore cooperation, and practically all of what we can expect from CASI in this regard are also areas that Singapore is keen to work with. From the digital economy and AI, 5G, autonomous vehicles, digitalization and supply chain resilience and diversification, all the way to global issues of climate change and public health. These sectors are aspects that were already previously specified under the NSP, but there is still much room for growth in CASI. So like I said, the Korea-Singapore Digital Partnership Agreement is a strong step, and it is likely that further projects for innovation and business towards other aspects of the digital economy should be worked on. This is especially as connectivity is one of the four priorities of the AOIP. A bilateral green economy agreement could also be a next path for consideration. Cooperation related to air pollution, waste management, and biodiversity laws are potential areas, as these are key environmental issues that Singapore faces on top of climate change. With limited renewable energy options, projects with relation to solar energy and liquefied natural gas will also be aspects for consideration. Finally, with efforts to strengthen public health resilience across the region in the wake of COVID-19, vaccines and pharmaceutics are also advantageous sectors to consider. Both countries have strong capabilities for R&D and should complement each other on the production and distribution of drugs and vaccines, and on the sharing of best practices and resources for capacity building. So nonetheless, it is key to recognize that there are fundamental boundaries and shared grounds to ensure effective cooperation through CASI. While both countries share areas for cooperation, there can still be potential elements of competitive interest, no less in biopharma and advanced technologies. It is important that regular communication and trust is built to strengthen bilateral ties and ascertain exactly what specific issues and substantive areas can be cooperated on. Both countries have positive foundations to work with, no less from an ease of familiarity due to your similarities as middle powers. Yet there must also continue to remain space for acceptance and understanding that while we share strategic interests and can collaborate on specific elements, it is not Singapore's position to take sides with regards to US-Chinese tensions. In this respect, ASEAN centrality and the AOIP are crucial to facilitate common ground. Nonetheless, it's reassuring that for the strategic clarity that CASI and IPS represents, the principles of inclusivity, trust, and reciprocity are key elements to also leave room for strategic dynamism. This shared understanding for practical openness is thus fundamental for future cooperation through CASI into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. So from your talk, I realized that actually our webinar today is also part of your research topic. Yeah, so part of this Korea-ASEAN or Korea-Singapore cooperation. Okay, so next, the fourth speaker will be Ms. Hun Thi Ha from the Yusof Ishak Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. She will look at the topic from the Vietnamese perspective. I think we all know that in recent years, Vietnam's economy has grown very strongly, partially also due to the continuous inflow from of investment from Korea. So I think Ms. Ha will definitely bring us some of her insights on this issue. Okay, Ms. Ha, please.
Thank you, Jung. I also would like to take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks to the Korea Center of the EAI and US and the Sejong Institute for having me at this webinar. And many thanks to Peng as well for always having confidence in me in all of these engagements. I also had a quick read of CASI just now, and I would like to echo Wang Yi's remarks that there is a lot of continuity from the NSP and CASI, which is a successor initiative to carry out Korea's continued interest and commitment to Southeast Asia. And as Wang Yi mentioned, CASI is more comprehensive in the sense that it includes a clearer security strategic component. But I also would like to add that compared to the NSP, CASI seems to be less on diplomatic rhetoric about, upgrading the importance of ASEAN and all that, but it has more specific and tangible targets with more concrete commitments and clearer priority areas. So my impression is that perhaps in this larger Indo-Pacific strategy of Korea, Southeast Asia and ASEAN may look less central because it's just a regional subset, but it is no less important, mainly because the fundamentals of South Korea, Southeast Asia, ASEAN relations remain unchanged, if not have been further strengthened from the Moon to the Yoon administration. And these include high degrees of economic complementarities and interdependencies, high level of mutual trust, cultural affinity, and no threat perceptions vis-a-vis each other. And also the increased significance that the ROK and Southeast Asian countries attach to each other in navigating the US-China strategic competition, because with closer partnership, they could afford each other more choices and greater maneuvering space to resist the pressure to take sides between the US and China. However, I also see that the change of government in the ROK last year has also brought about qualitative adjustments in the ROK's foreign policy, most notably its repositioning in the US-China competition. And while the Moon administration and the NSP tried to stay above the fray of great power politics, the Yoon administration has taken very concrete steps towards further strategic alignment with the US and other like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, which was discussed quite extensively in the previous discussion. In this next session, I would like to highlight a few points that are perhaps more pertinent to Vietnam. First, among the three themes of South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, namely freedom, peace, and prosperity, the peace and prosperity themes are quite straightforward, but the freedom theme signifies something different, which is expressed on two levels. Internationally and domestically. Internationally, I think Korea's vision of a rules-based regional order that is shaped not by force or coercion, but by rules and peaceful settlement of disputes through dialogues and international law resonates very strongly with Southeast Asian states, especially Vietnam, which is confronting China's excessive claims and assertive behaviors in the South China Sea. However, the application of freedom domestically through the lens of human rights and democracy would not go down well across the Southeast Asian region, especially in Vietnam. And in the early months of the Yoon administration last year, I was thinking whether this could potentially become a friction point in South Korea's relations with Southeast Asia. But I think at this moment, I could feel assured that such concern might be overblown, because despite all the rhetoric, I think the Yoon administration is continuing rather than deviating from Korea's long-held tradition of building up relations with Southeast Asia based on convergence of interest rather than values. The strategy, Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific strategy obviously adopts a tailored approach to different regions with different groups of partners. It highlights the importance of sharing democratic values with the US and other developed countries, but it does not refer to those values when it comes to Southeast Asia and ASEAN. The second point that I would like to make is that Vietnam is, I think, arguably the most important partner to South Korea in Southeast Asia. And the primary foundation of Vietnam-South Korea relations is commercial and economic, which transpires in all aspects, investment, trade, development assistance, and people-to-people exchanges. I think the importance of Korea to Vietnam economically cannot be overstated. It is the top foreign investor, the second largest ODA provider, the third largest trading partner, the second largest source of of foreign tourists, and also the second largest destination of Vietnamese migrant workers as well. So economic cooperation remains the aspect that Vietnam values the most in its relations with South Korea. And going forward, I think it would be very important to watch how South Korea can manage two apparently opposite trends in its external economic relations. For example, on the one hand, both Korean and Vietnamese companies and economies are very much integrated in the regional supply chain that heavily rely on China, not only as a major export market, but also as a key supplier of intermediate goods. And China is in fact the largest trading partner of both Korea and Vietnam. And I think this interdependence among these economies is expected to deepen further with the entry into force of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. But on the other hand, the South Korean government and companies have and will increasingly devote more resources into diversifying their supply chains to reduce dependency and vulnerabilities to the Chinese market. And I read the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, and I see that it is trying to do both. It wants to prevent the overwhelming dominance of security concerns over economic issues, but at the same time, it places greater emphasis on the need to stabilize and diversify supply chains for greater resiliency amid great power competition. How to position Vietnam in all of these dynamics? Vietnam is already the favorite place for South Korean companies in their diversification drive. Last year, President Yoon signaled that Korea will boost more investments in Vietnam in the high-tech sector and rare earths, for example, and that is actually already happening. For example, Samsung, which is, I think, the top foreign investor in Vietnam, will start making cheap parts in Vietnam, starting with the lower end sections such as packaging and testing. And last year, an agreement was signed for a Korean and Vietnamese company to jointly do rare earth mining in a province in Vietnam. So all of these are happening, and it will take time for us to see the impact going forward on how far this diversification drive can move more high-end, more high-value-added manufacturing investments to Vietnam. Last but not least, many analysts already point out that the Yoon administration's Indo-Pacific strategy is markedly different from the NSP in that it clearly embraces a more robust security foci beyond the emphasis on economic cooperation. But whether this greater focus on security cooperation would lead to deeper security ties between Vietnam and Korea remains to be seen. It is very interesting to note that despite their very robust economic cooperation, South Korea-Vietnam security cooperation remains very I think, modest. And I would still argue that the key driver for Vietnam-South Korea relations going forward remains focused on economic cooperation rather than strategic concerns. First, because of the pragmatic business-first approach by both the Korean and Vietnamese governments to their bilateral ties, but also because of what Wang Yi mentioned earlier, that both South Korea and Vietnam also, I would think, have strategic vulnerabilities and political sensitivities when it comes to their relations with China. Both countries will try to avoid all of these sensitivities, and so that they will not displease or be seen as confronting China. Having said that, I think there are several areas where bilateral security ties can be scaled up. For example, in maritime security, the Korean Indo-Pacific strategy says that South Korea will participate more actively in ongoing efforts to increase maritime domain awareness and support ASEAN countries' maritime law enforcement capabilities. And in fact, South Korea has already transferred 2 decommissioned naval ships to Vietnam in 2017 and 2018, and a third one is forthcoming as well. And last year, President Yoon said that Seoul will support the strengthening of Vietnam's capability to enforce maritime laws, of course, through hopefully through more naval ship transfers. Another area of potential growth in the future is arms trade. In the past few years, South Korea has risen to become among the top arms exporters worldwide, and actually the largest arms exporter to Southeast Asia, even surpassing Russia. But Vietnam's arms imports from South Korea surprisingly remain very, very low compared to other countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. So as Vietnam is trying to diversify its arms supply sources away from Russia, especially after the war in Ukraine, I think there are a lot of potentials for South Korea to step up its role here. I will stop here, and then maybe we can elaborate further on other points during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Ms. Huff, for looking at this issue from both the economic and also the security angles. Next, I'd like to hand the floor over to Ambassador Lim Sungnam from both the Foreign Ministry of Korea and also the Sejong Institute. He's a commentator for all the panelists in this session. Ambassador Lim, please.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chun, for the floor. Because all the points have been well covered by the previous speakers, I don't think I have much to add. But let me just make a couple of points. I think KASI can be seen from 2 different perspectives, from the bilateral perspective as well as the regional perspective. And if I look at the KASI from the bilateral perspective between Korea and ASEAN, I think while there was a comment on the change of government in Korea every 5 years, ASEAN policy has been one of the rare areas where continuity has been maintained, despite the change of the government from very progressive to very conservative. So while the name had changed from the New Southern Policy to KASI, but the emphasis of the Korean government's policy on Southeast Asia has remained and in a sense strengthened. I think the biggest difference between KASI and the New Southern Policy is 2. Number one, the fact that the ASEAN-related cooperation fund will be doubled by the year 2027 is a clear manifestation of the Yoon Suk Yeol government's determination to continue to upgrade the ties of cooperation between Korea and ASEAN. And number 2, I think the elaboration of the cooperation in the areas of strategy and defense is something new. It's a step forward in the right direction for the future of the relations between Korea and ASEAN, especially when we look at the changing security environment in the region. Just as a footnote, I'm sure that it might have been better if the name could be kept by the Yoon Suk Yeol government, like in the form of New Southern Policy 2.0, but maybe it's too ambitious when we look at the Korean domestic political landscape. And another footnote I want to make is, I think the name of our ASEAN policy would rather have been AXI rather than KASI, ASEAN Korea Solidarity Initiative, out of the respective for ASEAN centrality. But they are all footnotes. From the regional perspective, I will not repeat all those points made in the first section, as well as by Professor Choi Won-gi. But how to deal with the U.S.-China strategic rivalry is the key regional concern, I believe, facing Korea and ASEAN. And I do hope and believe, as mentioned by President Lee Sang-hyun, KASI can provide a certain intellectual framework for Korea and ASEAN to engage in deeper strategic dialogue between Korea and ASEAN regarding how to deal with the U.S.-China strategic rivalry in the coming years. About 10 years ago, when China was talking about peaceful rise to power, I had many chances to ask my Chinese counterparts and friends, what will be the end result of that dream? So what will be, what China will be able to provide when China rises to power peacefully? What kind of common goods, what kind of public goods can be provided by China? And I didn't get a clear-cut answer. Likewise, I believe the U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific region is, once again, to make a long story short, containing China. But what will be the end story of containing China for the coming years? And how long will it last? I think we should be able to ask those kind of questions, and we should be able to explore the answers to these questions, initially, say, between Korea and ASEAN, on the basis of KASI. In that regard, I believe that middle power diplomacy or a middle power group, such as Korea and ASEAN, should play a bigger role in crafting the way forward in the Indo-Pacific region, so that we can enjoy more peace and more stability down the road, rather than delegating our destiny just to big superpowers in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lim, for your very insightful comments and analysis. You have dealt not only with the speeches and the topic in this session, but also more broadly the global situation, especially the big power relationship between China and the United States. So I'm not in the position to comment on that, but I do want to say that actually I think this kind of tension will continue. It can last very long. So for other powers around China or United States in this region, especially for mid powers, actually probably need to be prepared for a long-lasting this kind of confrontational tension between the superpowers. So middle power need to form a kind of middle power strategies, which I mentioned just now. Probably one of the focuses should be on the cooperation among the middle powers. Yeah. And if you are using the strategy correctly, maybe middle power one day can also become superpowers. Yeah. So who knows? Yeah. So anyway, I think we still have some minutes for free discussion for this session. Yeah, I've already seen Professor Cho. You raise your hand, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to add a couple of points to the excellent comment made by Ambassador Lim. So one of the topics of the today's webinar is what's the difference of the concept of Indo-Pacific among ASEAN member countries and Korea. I think in the comments made by Ambassador Lim, I think it is clear that I mean, it is popular perception that Korea is just blindly following the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States and Japan. And one of the domestic criticisms about this new Seoul's strategy is that, I mean, given the differences of national interest between South Korea and US and Japan, why does Seoul follow America's and Japan's strategy? That kind of criticism, right? But I think that's a little bit off the mark. I mean, if you look at the document, if you look at the strategic orientation and intention embedded in the document, I mean, the primary goal of South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy is not take a side with America in containing China. I mean, South Korea is not in a position politically, economically, strategically, culturally to contain China. I mean, given the wide differences in terms of the military power, economic dependence, all sorts of relationship, how can South Korea can antagonize or adopt a anti-China military and defense strategy? That's impossible. So I think it's gross misunderstanding that China criticizes South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy as a kind of South Korea taking side with the U.S. and try to provide the military basis for Americans in their campaign against China. That's wrong, I think. But that does not necessarily mean that we shut up ourselves and keep quiet. I mean, as a liberal democracy, as a free trading nation, we do have clear strategic economic interest in the freedom of navigation, the rules-based or things like that. I think so far, Korea has not been so forthcoming in talking about these Korea's national interest and strategic interest, right? So given the differences between China and us, I think first, I think you need to speak out. You need to clarify what's your interest, and then you can manage the differences, right? So in that regard, I don't think Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy is a way of Seoul taking side with America against China. I think it's more of the exercise of agency, pursuing an independent foreign policy. I mean, China is branding Seoul's Indo-Pacific strategy is just a Seoul blindly following U.S. lead. I think China is very well aware of the strategic, economic, and military vulnerability of South Korea. So branding, I mean, depicting Korea's strategy in this way is not really helpful and healthy for maintaining a constructive relationship. So in that regard, I think there are a lot of rooms that Korea and Southeast Asian partners can work together, right? I mean, rebuilding your strategic identity and preferences is one issue, and managing the differences and actual diplomacy is another issue, right? So in that regard, I think there are some slight differences, but I don't think this is a radical departure. I think this is just the part of the evolution of Korea's overall strategic outlook and foreign policy. I mean, Korea has come a long way from a deprived, impoverished, poor country after the Korean War. Now, Korea is 10th largest economy, right? I mean, how can we keep the kind of the external outlook of a poor country? We are not anymore. We can do that more, right? So we need to adjust constantly our external strategic outlook and manage relationships. So in that regard, I think there is a strong continuity in our overall foreign policy and things like that. So I think we need to take a longer term, broader perspective to assess this new Seoul's new strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Choi. I cannot agree with you more on this blindly following issue. I don't think any country, anyone these days should blindly follow another person or another country. Yeah. So we should have our own independent thinking. So I think due to time constraint, probably come to the final part of our webinar, which is closing remarks and thanks. So first, I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Yoon Suk Choi, Director of the Center of Indo-Pacific Studies of the Sejong Institute. Dr. Hyun, please. Dr. Choi, please.
This insightful discussion today we had, and I especially want to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Peng, Professor Hofman, and other colleagues at East Asia Institute at NUS, and also distinguished moderators and panelists for preparing this webinar and leading it to a successful conclusion. While looking forward to continuing this very much insightful intellectual efforts to figure out what kind of a world we want to live in under this severe power competition, and what actions we can take together to bring about those changes in the future. I hope that we can work together to move beyond this and to develop tangible steps towards implementing the Indo-Pacific strategies together. Okay, thank you. And I'd like to invite Professor Hyun Lee for his last words.
Well, thank you very much. I think we had a very good conversation today, and as I mentioned earlier, I indeed hope that Sejong Institute and National University of Singapore, or EAI, could continue this kind of intellectual endeavor to shape better Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, as I understand, since the South Korean government announced its own Indo-Pacific strategy, still I believe there's a lot of things to do to develop more actionable implementation of the strategy. So in order to do that, perhaps we need to work together with the Asian countries. And so because of that, I indeed hope that we can continue this collaboration in the future. And particularly, I would like to thank Dr. Choi Jung and Peng to organizing this wonderful event. Thank you.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really delighted and grateful to the following people who made this webinar success. First and foremost, my thanks to His Excellency, Republic of Korea, Ambassador to Singapore, Choi, for his unflinching support to the Korea Center at the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore, all these years. And I would also like to thank Republic of Korea Councillor Park Yuri for working behind the scenes to help me with this webinar and also in various activities of the Korea Center at the East Asian Institute. And of course, I have to thank Sejong President, Professor Lee Sang-hoon. If he had said no to me, this webinar would not have been possible, you know, but he was so positive when I met him in Seoul. And because of that, he also introduced me to a very brilliant Professor Choi Jung. And she had been so nice. She's so good. Whenever I write to her, she responds so quickly. And really, you know, organizing this webinar had been so smooth, even though Republic of Korea is in Northeast Asia and ASEAN, you know, we are in Southeast Asia, and yet we have harnessed technology to bring people together, bring hearts together. And I'm so glad we have friends from Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and of course my friends from Singapore coming together to make this possible. And of course, I would like to thank EAI Senior Manager James Tan and my research assistant, Mr. Gordon Kang, for helping behind the scenes for making this possible. I'll end by echoing the sentiments of Sejong Institute President Lee Sang-hoon. I will echo the sentiments that I hope that this will not be just a one-off webinar, just the first and last webinar between Korea Center at EAI and Sejong Institute. I hope we'll do this hopefully every year, and if budget permits, I hope we can do it in person next time, you know, somewhere in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, or perhaps in Seoul. So without further ado, I would like to thank all the participants who have been so patient, been with us since 9 a.m. Singapore time, 10 a.m. Seoul time. And I wish everybody, I think for Singapore, we are not late for lunch, but I think in Seoul, I think you are slightly late for lunch, you know. So human rights very important. Eating well is a human right. And I wish everybody a good lunch. And thank you so much. You know, I'm so glad that Cho Wong-gi, my old friend, is on the screen, and everyone. And of course, thanks to Ambassador Lim Sungnam, you know, you're a voice of moderation and a voice of very, very good guidance and very good comments, you know, very sensible comments to all of us. So thank you, Ambassador Lim Sungnam, for spending your time to share your views with us. So without further ado, I would like to say thank you and good morning and also good afternoon to my friends in Seoul. Thank you and bye-bye.